I am seeing if I can actually. I don't want a green screen. No green screen. Okay. So this is pretty impromptu, and I don't have a lot of time, but I am hoping that I can explain something quickly that I think is incredibly important right now. And frankly, if it still shocks me that I seem to be one of the only people talking about this. Where is Camille Paglia when we need her? And where are the other artists who used to talk about these things? So, look, I know that there's a lot of artists out there who are concerned about being able to work, being able to, make a living at what it is that they do. And I have a huge, tremendous amount of respect for them. I also know there's a lot of artists out there who earn a living doing things that they traditionally don't necessarily consider to be art or careers in the arts. First of all, that's an incredible mistake. The fine arts is not the only arts that exist. However, the use of fine arts as a way of communicating an idea, story, narrative, you name it, as something that is in the domain of the majority of humans on the on the planet, that we all have access to these things, is relatively new. Um, and the flat out ignorance or lack of awareness or leadership coming from the domain of the arts is no longer something that I think frankly, I don't think we could survive it. Um, I'm seeing a lot of indication that more and more people are committing the exact same pattern that we thought we defeated by standing up against the COVID narrative. But now just look at what's going on the so-called, new media or new right. The ignorance and the arrogance about people who don't understand some basic art history in general, is so shocking to me. The arrogance, lack of deference, and constant combativeness of it, as well as the very people that have been effectively communicating what ideas are about, woke, as well as this rise of so-called, what we're calling Jew hate or anti-Semitism, but being purely identitarian about it. First of all, I have been asking and requesting for as long as I can remember to stop using Jews as scapegoats, as either a sword or a shield. Why? Because you are feeding into the exact narrative which leads to utter destruction. And I don't just mean of Jews. Like, I'm not actually, it's funny, I'm not really afraid of what would happen if somebody decided to hurt or kill me because I'm a Jew. Maybe it's because I've already gone through the whole anti vaxxer thing. What I'm afraid of is that if people don't recognize the way that these things operate and stop being so damn literal about it, that we're looking at a dark age. I've been saying this since the very beginning of lockdowns. Anybody who follows me on Facebook, they know this. If you don't believe me, go onto Facebook, do a search under my name for the phrase butterflies, right? I've been talking about this for so long, and I can't seem to make any headway. So if it's my failure, I apologize. The fact of the matter is, though, I need some help. And whatever somebody might think of me personally or my personality or whatever, doesn't matter. I don't know anyone else talking about this. And I'm really concerned that what's the direction that we're heading in is exactly what I was worried about. And Americans have such a propensity to think that they somehow are immune to what has happened and reoccurred to happen over and over again. But the worst part is, I don't even think Americans realize how much we are living under something that is equivalent to a totalitarian system in every way that matters the most. And I know it's not just my experience. I know that it's starting to happen and it's amplified, and that the so-called influencers who, with great work that protected us from a lot of things, are now in fact feeding into that same thing, not because that they're bad people, but because no one seems to recognize that the banality of evil really does flow into each of us, and that the real problem is not a purely political one or a purely, it's not like we have two different, um, class things battling it out. We don't. That is the biggest lie. And our very own new media is picking up exactly what the old media was doing. This is textbook. I worked at CNN. I talked about this way back when. Strategic integration all over again. This is not because these people, it's not like, I'm sorry, it's not like Candace Owens is actually this horrible, I just lost signal, now I'm back. It's not, you guys overly emotional and place too much good, bad, evil, bad on top of all this. You've got to try to understand how easy it is to convince anyone that there's some dark cabal out there. I mean, all right, we've got to start looking at this with some reason. And here's the biggest problem. It's the arts, stories, film, the art of science, the things that are not necessarily able to be peer reviewed and proven. The entire intellectual environment, top to bottom, the same people who let COVID happen are the same people who are still supposedly thinking of themselves as the makers of wealth, manners. They're the people who somehow we should finally trust. They still no nothing has changed. And the biggest reason nothing has changed is that the moment when things started to change, October 7th happened, and then suddenly everybody now is on like Team Palestine, Team Israel. Do you really think that this was not on purpose? I mean, at what point are you going to start to understand, truly understand, that this is not a partisan issue? The only thing that's partisan about it is that the power of party, we were warned about it, allows for this to continue. If you don't understand the way in which a structure of a narrative can be concocted and reused over and over again, and that every single person is very, 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 very much lacking the immune system to push back against it. Either, first of all, if you're a Jew, you forgot why it is we tell the same stories over and over and over again. Why there are 3 stories about our actual liberation, so that we don't constantly think of ourselves as slaves. It's a mindset. But that's exactly the secret of our immortality and why we survive so long. So how about we pass this along rather than, because first of all, for the longest time, actually, let me say this. I'm not so much annoyed with fellow Jews right now. What I want to know is, why is it that fellow Christians, do you honestly think that standing up and protecting us, as you see, isn't just another form of virtue signaling? How about maybe, just maybe, a little bit of a collaboration so that we can actually talk about what's going on? Or are you just another person that's so interested in making sure that one Jew who died on a cross, that you're respecting him rather than humanity? I mean, is that really, can you say with certainty that that's what God would want? I know I certainly can't. I mean, I'm really, really completely befuddled by what's going on, especially when I point out to people that the entire narrative around modern jihad came from Mao. And I knew this was going to happen. I called it out 3 years ago, and I'm so depressed by the fact that I have been an utter failure in finding any way to really make a move. But at least I'm not canceled, which is great. But here's the thing: if we keep pretending that there's something going on that a lot of people don't know about, and if I can't find any way of having some wisdom to help me explain this, then all I can do is just basically share with you what men far wiser than myself have said. And that's what I'm going to do now. And why do I bother? It's certainly not for the money. There is no money in this. In fact, I've sacrificed basically everything for this. The reason is that because I am this serious, it is something that I love, I know is important. And for me, how I relate to God is entirely based on this. It's not, if people think truth is simply in liturgy, and yet they're not wise enough to realize that Torah is not written in either ancient Greek or English. You keep talking about going to the original source. I know that the thing that we all share as Abrahamic religions is that there's a knowledge that storyteller, book, how narratives are done, how humanity is so vitally important for this unfolding of existence and also his creations. We have a responsibility to creator to tell these stories and not allow artifice to rule. Because if we don't, then what are we doing? Just sitting there acting like, you know, any other foolish people kind of waiting for salvation? That means we are already suckered by liberation theology. I mean, are we really going to say, are we really going to believe that after everything that we've gone through, that we are really going to become the stereotype of letting this stuff become an opiate? 'Cause my God, we've got nobody to blame but ourselves for that one. And if you really think that you can have religion without art, well, that's fine. But I know there's a lot of you who know better. Because that's my circle. That's the people I've always been talking to. Where the hell are you? What the heck is going on? And I made a video a long time ago saying we're not doing our job. We really are not doing our job. I mean, you think that sitting around and chatting on Facebook or chatting on X and arguing about these things, do you think we're ever going to be a majority? We're not. We never are. But what's being destroyed? I mean, how many times do we have to watch younger people come into this world and make claims that are so obtuse and ignorant that were placed into their minds by people who were not really educators? And yet we think we're winning against woke? Are you insane? Look, Mao was a poet. His wife was a dancer. Okay. Hitler, yes, he was a painter. But how about the critic who spotted what he actually could do? We stop looking at all of this through some deconstructed version of morality. Because eventually what's going to happen is there's going to be nothing left. Look at China. They can't tell stories. And look right now, anybody who's critical of the CCP, they get demonetized. Their range. I mean, people have been talking about this. I am not any good at marketing. But what I am persuading here and trying to is just to keep it real, live not by lies, and look at reality. While everybody is fighting and claiming about, Jew hate, who does that benefit? And I don't just mean the CCP in China. How about the Maoists who are just Maoist adjacent, or the same people who benefited from having no sense of, there's some bad people out there. And there's some people who aren't necessarily bad, but they just survive. They know how to survive. And I've seen more and more of that. Good people who they're really good at surviving. But what are we going to be left with? I mean, how much more needs to happen? What's my core point, Rodwin? If you've not been following for a while, this may seem a little strange to you. Here, I'll let somebody else make the point. My core point here is that there have been plenty of dissidents from the past who have said exactly what I've said. And the only reason you don't know about them is because they weren't looking at these things purely politically. I've said a long time what liberation theology is really good at, where you want to call it radical collectivism, socialism, fascism, they're all the same. What it's really good at, or totalitarian creep is really good at, is elevating mediocrity into positions of power and sustaining it. And nobody wants to hear about the reality of what things have happened, whether it's under China or in Hungary or from survivors, because here's the thing. It's not an empty phrase or good talking point. It doesn't fit into a box that makes you feel useful. Because that's it. Turning you into a utility of something that is of use is pure totalitarian. Art is useless. And to quote Ionescu, if you don't understand the use of the useless, you cannot understand art. And if you cannot understand the reduction of everything to utility, you cannot understand totalitarianism. And this is not a new fight. It's a very old one. And I'm very disappointed in the people who should know this by now, but seem to be much more interested in making sure they can maintain their brand or their, revenue stream, or taking everything so personally that they're not collaborating or looking at this other direction, because this is not the first time this has happened. So here's what Tom Stoppard, the playwright, and he's still alive, one of the few from a certain particular age that, you know, I'm sure he didn't pass some purity test or another, maybe even during COVID, but it doesn't matter. Because what an artist does, and I don't just mean somebody who's a fine artist, what they do, they're able to see something that is true. And I am hoping that somebody out there can find a way to explain this stuff in such a way that enough people can hear it, so that we can continue this idea of, as Douglas Murray says, this age of reconstruction, and actually feel empowered again. Because at this point, when you look at what's happened, and how much more do you need to know to just kind of see the sticky fingers of let's call it, the motivations of some pretty dark actors. And I keep pointing to the CCP, but it's not just that. But it's pretty clear that it's very much part of that. And how do we know? Look at how COVID unfolded. So with all the energy we're going to put into Fauci and all of that stuff, we're ignoring and not able to see something that was put into place about 100 years ago. And there are definitely some people who don't lack the moral or sense of real patriotism, or even just whatever. And there's very few people that have the courage to be uncommon. And that's one of the key points. With all this energy that goes into the Tate brothers, all this energy that goes into, the more time we spend on the trivial and the gossip, the less time we spend on actually dealing with the reality that's being completely taken over by a Sok reality, or a socialist reality, but it's really just Sok, a false reality. So Tom Stoppard, Introduction to the Memorandum. For those who don't know, Václav Havel became the first president of Czechoslovakia after the fall of the Soviet Union. He led the writing of the Charter 77, which was the manifesto that inspired the Polish uprising of workers to push back against the Soviet Union. And anyone who's ever told you that the way that the Soviet Union fell was because of some economic, political, or actions by intelligence and not by the people, they are lying to you. It's not how it happened. And frankly, it's still not over, because we did not win the Cold War. Mao beat Stalin. That's where we are. And the question becomes, what are we going to do about it? So here's what he says. Václav Havel's career as a playwright has been brief in his own country. And so for those who don't know, Tom Stoppard wrote, for film-wise, he wrote Shakespeare in Love. He's written also the plays Arcadia, recently the Leopoldstadt. He is one of the most prolific and brilliant living playwrights and writers. In general, he's in the United Kingdom. And turns out he found out later in life that his ancestry is Jewish Czechoslovakian, and he never knew. That's why he wrote Leopoldstadt. It began with the Garden Party in 1963 and was suspended in 1968 by the Husak regime, which took power in the wake of the Soviet invasion a few months after Havel's third play. The increased difficulty of concentration had opened in Prague. The Memorandum is the play that came between those two in 1965. Despite the ban on performances of his work in Czechoslovakia, Havel has continued to write, and latterly has produced a doppelganger, a playwright and persona non grata named Ferdinand Vanek, whose adventures are sardonically recalled so far in 3 short plays: Audience, Private View, and Protest. Even so, the Memorandum possibly remains his most widely performed play, and the one which best shows off the hallmarks of his gift. The fascination with language, the invention of an absurd society raised only a notch or two above the normal world of state bureaucracy. The absurdities pushed to absurdity, compounded by absurdity, and yet saved from mere nonsense by the internal logic, and not least, the playfulness with which it is done, the almost gentle refusal to indulge a sense of grievance, the utter lack of righteousness or petulance or bile. The same quality, in fact, which was to distinguish the Vanek place 10 years later, by which time Havel might have been forgiven for writing with bitterness. For let it be said that while this edition of the memorandum was being prepared for the press in April 1980, its author was entering the 6th month of a 4.5-year prison sentence, meted out for crimes which have no counterpart in a free society. Havel's first spell in prison was in 1977. He had been arrested in January soon after the appearance of Charter 77. A document calling upon the Czech government to abide by its own laws. Havel, as one of the 3 designated spokesmen for the Charter, and the best known, was kept in prison for 4 months and ultimately given a suspended sentence of 14 months. Despite his extreme vulnerability, he associated himself the following year with the Committee for the Defense of Unjustly Persecuted, VONS in the Czech acronym. 11 members of VONS were arrested in March 1979, and 6 of these, including Havel, were brought to trial in October, when the very existence of VONS was defined as an act of subversion. A proper account of those proceedings and a proper recognition of the other defendants would be in order, but to a prospective reader of the memorandum, the most pertinent echo from that trial is that of the words spoken by Havel to his judges before he was sentenced. Needless to say, no official record exists, and the quotation does not claim to be verbatim, but nevertheless, this is what the author of this play had to say. The system is based on a priori assumption that the state can do no wrong. The decision of a court is regarded as being infallible in principle. I want to stress that this assumption of infallibility is very dangerous. Anyone who questions it is automatically defined as an enemy, and everything he does is qualified as hostile. If the institutions of the state can never be in error, then anybody criticizing their actions is logically engaging in slander, vilification, and so on. And why should somebody vilify? Naturally out of hostility. And if out of hostility, then naturally in collusion with a foreign, hostile, and anti-socialist power. The indictment does not mention what should be the critical issue, the crucial issue, the contents of the Vaughn's statements. This persecution cannot allow any consideration of what Vaughn's actually said, because to allow that would be tantamount to conceding the possibility of the state's fallibility. If you write that student X copied a piece of Václav Havel and gave it to his fellow students to read, it does not sound nearly so serious as it does when you write that student X duplicated and distributed in an illegal manner an anti-socialist pamphlet by a right-wing exponent. There are certain words which reoccur continually in the indictment, which one would describe as loaded. Words like subversion, lies, malice, illegal organizations, anti-communist centers, vilification, hatred, and so on. However, when one looks closely at these words, one finds that there is nothing behind them. End quote. Yes, we are, Michael. We are hurtling into the dark ages, but we don't have to. In fact, people like you and I, it is our duty not to just observe it. Our duty. No matter what. Doesn't matter how likable we are. Doesn't matter how hard it is. This is our duty. This is what we have to do. Like we have to. I'm only here because my grandfather's not. I'm not going to let his suffering and the destruction of everything he knew to win just because otherwise we're cowards. Just like Solzhenitsyn said, All it takes is a couple of people being bold enough. But I am just a woman. I'm a girl. I'm the more vulnerable. And I want to know where the men are. Sincerely. I don't want to hear about how liberation theology came after women first and, you know, made you all feel bad about yourself. There's nothing I can do about that. But I'm not going to indulge it. Stoppard continues. If, as nowadays, one might easily suppose the proper study of literary man is the intersection of a writer's work and his experience, what a gift that statement seems to offer. He's referring to what Havel said. Here is a play about words, infallibility, logic, and the system. Yet to make too much of that would be to distrust, or rather to distract attention from the inventiveness of the memorandum. We are introduced to a new official language. It's PTIDEPE, TEDEPE, designed to banish the confusions of natural, unscientific language and based on maximizing the difference between words so that no word can conceivably be mistaken for another. The length of a word being propositional in the frequency of use. The word for wombat has 319 letters. Alas, TEDEPE begins to assume some of the characteristics of natural language, emotional overtones, ambiguities, and so on, and therefore replaced by a new language, Charukor, whose principle is to maximize the resemblance between two words. That Monday becomes il pagar, Tuesday il pagar, etc. And the worst that can happen is that the right things will occur on the wrong day of the week. In the lifelike encounters of the Vonic plays, experience does indeed provide a template for art. But here one relishes the joyous freedom of Havel's imagination. In 1965, joy and freedom seemed possible. Why am I mentioning Stoppard here? Because artists, despite how they've been depicted for the longest time as just these suffering, cruel, people who, starve for their work, in the darkest times, artists are the ones who can't help but see the light at the end, that light that's in human beings. Polemics and politics don't do that. We are living in an age where even Shakespeare, I've heard far too many people with power try to make a claim that Shakespeare is either useless or even bad. Why? Okay, why? Okay, Radwin, you're asking, but why interference in art? So Radwin, let me ask you this question. What do you mean? Why interference in art? Are you asking me why do they use the art specifically to promote and push totalitarian creep? Or why am I trying to make some interference? Please, can you clarify the question? Because I'm not sure. I think it's the former, but I'll tell you that the reason why the arts is, first of all, it should be obvious. Let's define art, right? So, at what point in our history, of human history, did we live in an age, for how long of a period of time, where most people had access or the experience of art at all? We know, for example, and I'm not making a qualitative judgment here, that through art, Christianity was spread. So is it really all that surprising that another religious way of looking at the world is being spread utilizing art? See, Sok realism is not simply an artistic style, it's a philosophy. And it's a cornerstone of a way of interacting not only within a political sphere, but outside of it. They're a way of interacting outside of it. There's a singular way of communicating that allows for this Leviathan to continue on and on. Is that so difficult to imagine? So what? Let me rephrase it this way. How about if I said it this way? We're not dealing with a political movement. We're actually dealing with a religious ideology. I'm going to call it liberation theology that believes that you are enslaved and therefore you must be liberated. So, in order to prove this to you, it has to make you feel that you are enslaved. This is why people who have survived communist regimes will often say, I was born free. Liberty and freedom are not the same thing at all. And in this country, my concern is that we are such a young country that has never had to face how powerful the use of arts and literature, media, all of that is. So we can't imagine that a person would be relegated and sent to Siberia for what they wrote. So, and Michael, maybe one day you and I can actually find a way to communicate these things from two different vantage points, because I am fully aware of the fact that many people are unable to recognize the fact that when I'm talking about the arts, because of deconstruction, the presumption is that that here we have art and here we have science, and the two never cross. Well, let me give you a example from history why the arts matter so much and why it's an absolute lie being that was very intentional to remove a sense of reason from the arts and from arts from the sciences. That somehow I would dare say the over feminization, and I mean this from a masculization, feminization. There's we need that balance of everything was also intentional. So we can say that liberation theology's first target was my gender, was women. So that would make a lot of sense. Convince women that they are, one, being oppressed by patriarchy or whatever it is, and that they have to be liberated. And two, convince them that somehow, through technology, science, and pure will, that women, that we can somehow have it all. Well, men and women are inherently different. Our sense of time, what we're able to do, what we should do to our bodies, etc., inherently different. So the first stage of this, of liberation theology, come out there, create this weird division, not even acknowledge that there are a difference between the sexes. And then let me also remind you that Marx himself said you can basically gauge where a society is based on the status of women. And if you're talking about Marx, who always had an agenda, which was historical materialism, which despite what they'll say, always is only through the perspective of Marxism or liberation theology. Is it that difficult to believe that there is another religious system, liberation theology, which looks at everything only through that perspective? Just like, say, for many Christians, everything was leading up to the birth of Christ and Christ being on the cross and then his resurrection. In this philosophy and or theology, everything can be justified based upon where it is in regards to how does it further along or does it slow down the inevitable promised positive future of the revolution, which is basically one of the biggest scams concocted by people who were never on the lower strata of Caucasus. I mean, it's always a top-down revolution, always, and they use narratives to do this. So realism is not just an aesthetic; it's a way of telling a story, and it's the same thing done over and over and over again. And frankly, as a Jew, I'll say this: we make a great scapegoat for this. It's almost as if it almost feels like it's built into the fabric of the universe. And I'm not resentful of God for this. It's just a fact that, we have to be either a mound or a ditch, right? That's it. And how are we going to be used in order to propagate this idea that somehow humanity is just completely at the mercy of the march of history coming over us? You know, oh, I know it was directed towards Radin, Michael, but I think that, I mean, I would, if you would like to, I'm trying to figure out ways. I mean, I have to move on the 24th and I've got a lot going on for myself and I've got to focus on being able to pay the rent. But, which, it is what it is. But the thing is this, Russians, in Russian history, you saw Dostoevsky talk about this. You saw the actual realists, Balzac, all of them pointing at this. And then suddenly, what happens? Everything is conducive towards pushing a very clear agenda, which is the spread of revolution throughout the world. Now, if we are foolish enough to not see how what that leads to ultimately is essentially mass conversion. When we talk about, if we look at this through a lens of liberation theology and not through a political lens, then it becomes very clear we're not even talking about agnosticism here. We're talking about a way of viewing the world in which the way you relate to creator or God, whether you're an atheist, it doesn't even matter, but just the perspective that you have is much more akin to what was going on with the Aztecs and what got us into COVID and what gets us into situations where we are willing to sacrifice our own children and our own selves to some debt. It is an incredibly effective way of spreading totalitarian creep. And the goal of that, control. It's simple. But the real scary part is, have you ever asked yourselves why, say, for example, Mao was so terrifyingly efficient at destroying all memory of art in China? Or why they are so effective at manipulating trade, relationships, and you name it. And if maybe, just maybe, part of our problem is that the further we go into this realm where it's a world we can't understand, the easier it is for them. And by them, I mean the Gorkies of the CCP, meaning the same thing as Goebbels, the propagandists. And there are many of them that are not even really motivated by anything other than the same thing that motivates most people in media, which is apathy, indifference, sociopathy, and just looking out for themselves, which you can't really blame either because radical self-reliance is inherently part of American structure. But what faster way to destroy what individualism meant and what the American dream meant than to basically prove that life is struggle. It's if we keep thinking that the lockdowns, shutting down of theaters, the purges that were Me Too and Times Out because they were purges, that all of that stuff, gentlemen, men, I'm asking you, if we keep letting it go on like that and you all don't stand up, what world are you leaving your kids? I mean, I don't have them. I don't have children. I My motivation is really just this cuckoo love for something that I don't want to see be destroyed. And other dissident artists shared that. I would encourage you to read Fragments of a Journal by Eugene Ionescu, the writings of Václav Havel, the pleas of Meyerhold. Read about the Night of the Dead Poets, which occurred on August 12th, 1952. 1952 in Russia. I'm going to leave you with this story. And it's so similar in many ways to what happened with COVID because the art of medicine's been lost too. And I know too many people, too many brilliant people who were so wrong about this, treated me so horribly in New York or even elsewhere. And I am not angry at them. I am just afraid that we still don't see what will eventually happen or what's already beginning to happen. Because if you think that everyone's going to end up in a gulag, you're not paying attention. You don't seem to see how this mechanized religion that's been creeping along human society since before the Aztecs. I mean, what more do you need to see to understand that our very survival as a species depend on this? And but what will we have? What will we be doing? What kind of people will we be? How long have we been making incredible works? We keep complaining about even architecture not being as beautiful, but don't you see why that is? Like, if we keep letting our children be so focused on partisanship, if we keep letting our those people who end up in power and influence not have the sense that what good is that if we're going to end up living in a world where, okay, sure, you're going to have all your needs met, but there's no going to be getting really great stories. Nothing will awe or inspire you. And then in a few years, your kids might be, masked again and again and again. Or you might have to fight off another. Like, this is what never again and never forget always was about. So I'm going to tell you, after the Holocaust, or the Shoah, because I hate the word Holocaust, because, I really would rather us not be remembered as burnt offerings, because that's a little creepy. And as far as I'm concerned, that's the way in which genocide was used as another surrealist narrative to control and create menticide. Because who the heck would pray to the God of Auschwitz? But we still did, and we still do. And that's what makes Jews dangerous, and that's what makes artists dangerous too. Because what we do doesn't make any sense. When it comes down to it, it doesn't. I can't explain it. I can't explain why I feel so passionate about this stuff. And well, Redwin, one thing I'll say here is that here's the problem: is that the pursuit of truth has become like a golden calf. There's something in the domain of not knowing that's empowering, that gives us power. The fact that I know that I cannot know God, but I still choose Him, just like with each other. I can't know somebody, but out of a sense of honor, I'll choose them. And I think that's a really big point. We don't have any sense of honor anymore. So we're surrounded by cluster B and we keep complaining about it, but we don't have a sense of honor. We don't even pass along what that means. We don't talk about integrity anymore. We just watch in a spectacle as people, as human beings, behave more and more like animals, thinking there's nothing we can do and we're powerless to stop it. That's exactly what a silk realist narrative does. And it's been going on, especially since World War I. And men, you guys have been such a target because you've been taught that if you behave honorably, you could be punished. And yes, there's a wickedness coming from women in this, but help, because we can't beat this if we don't simply choose. Here's a good example. Read Daybreak by Nietzsche, and then you tell me that Nietzsche actually hated Jews. And ask yourself why it is that you actually didn't know this. In Daybreak, he talks specifically about this, but what is he talking about? The destruction of America, what will that do to the world? The lack of a liberal arts education and a knowledge about certain things that are a blessing to know. May memory be a blessing. What will that do? So here is a story about the dead poets, and I'll leave it with that. People don't know the history of theater or entertainment very well at all. And when they do, they mostly look at it through the lens of identity. The first, quote, anti-fascists, but not the German anti-fascists, the actual anti-fascists, were really given that title in Russia in the Yiddish theater. The Yiddish theater was actually, at this point, being funded and supported by the Soviet government. Why? Well, they did that because they knew the power of the narrative and propaganda. And frankly, there was enough complaints within some Jewish communities. I mean, what else is new? That they were able to use this to push an anti-religious sentiment. So they said, okay, Yiddish theater, you can stay open, but no God, only culture. And first of all, even though they remembered the pogroms from just years before or days before in some cases, they agreed because you got Hitler on one side, they want to kill you. Now they don't want to kill you. Okay, so good. So the Yiddish theater was allowed to continue on, and for the longest time too, because Sok realism had just become the law of the land. They weren't under the biggest watch of the censors. The censors were really busy, with people like Meyerhold and everything else. And this was really what I'd hoped would happen, by the way, in lockdowns in New York, that there's going to be a vibrancy and a will to keep going, and I've not seen it. That's why I'm so concerned. But there, some of the most incredible work was created. And meanwhile, the director of the Yiddish theater, he was so proud of the fact that with his connections and stuff, he was able to speak to fellow Jews and help them get into schools to overcome bigotry. And he thought he was doing the best thing he could. But in true Stalinist form, Stalin ended up hearing about this arrogance. So what did he do? He invited every single member of the theater to a party, except the director, and killed them, leaving only the director alive. This is a minor holiday in Israel, Jewish holiday known as the Night of the Dead Poets, August 12th, 1952. It's incredible that no one knows. I guess that question becomes who's left? What's more striking to me is not how easy it is for people to believe, but how easy it is to destroy memory. It's so easy. I'll leave you with one more thought. If you think, for example, to thine own self be true is good advice, check your memory. Words and language are so powerful. And as Václav says, it's just through the use of the empty phrase that totalitarian creep continues on and on and on. Because power is not in some ruling clique. I mean, we were sitting there watching and complaining and worried about Trump now. The real problem is that you forgot that the fight's not over. People wanting to sit there and win, and we're doing such a disservice to the next generation to come. And if we continue to wait for some form of justice, then we forgot what the Nuremberg trials were all really about, crimes against humanity. So I'm hoping that people will start having conversations. I myself have been wanting to focus on the arts specifically, have made proposals on what I think needs to happen, but I don't know. I hope that people will help me launch that hidden sphere, but I'm not going to beg. Can't do it all on my own. But we're not gonna be from the safety of behind screens, and eventually, this is what the gulag will look like. Because who's going to be there for us if we continue to allow media and talking heads and stuff to keep thinking that influence is determined by advertising dollars? I mean, it's getting worse. It's not getting better. There's no connoisseurship. Audiences are gone because we're letting it happen. Who's left? And at some point, it's the people who've got the means to simply be patrons who keep it afloat. And I can't help but ask, who's left? You know, we're so obsessed with and addicted to politics that it feels like a soap opera and entertainment. And this has happened before in Rome. It's exactly what led to the fall of Rome, as we say, because it's always cancel culture. They're always called domini memori, destruction of memory. All revolutions destroy culture. All revolutions destroy libraries of Alexandria. That's what UNESCO said. And I plead with people to go back to the arts, go back, listen to music, try to see what they were saying there, and keep it alive because it's just as easy as that it's gone. And all we have to do is look at places like China to see that. Renaissance was not that long ago, and not a lot of people saw it. And America was political. What a sad world. So I hope that makes sense. Truth is not. I don't think truth is what we should be hunting for, but we should be speaking truth. It's different. Or because truth can blast through totalitarian faith like anything, but now it feels almost like everybody's playing a game of manhunt with truth or making it into a game. Like how many truth points did I get? It's not human. That's like a machine. So that I'm gonna go, but please don't let the arts die. Don't think it's trivial because it's not. And I'm doing the best I can, but I'm failing at it. And just keep it going. And if there's ever any requests for anything in particular people want to know about, just reach out. I would be more than happy to explain anything, but you just gotta ask me. I don't even exactly know which direction to go anymore. And I actually have to worry about paying rent and other personal things because since leaving New York, I don't have a safety net or a network. That's how it goes. But I can't stop trying. So ask me specific questions. I'm more than happy to explain. As for as for the next thing, I highly recommend reading the book by J.F. Martel, Reviving Art in the Age of Artifice. It's short, highly recommended, deeply recommended. It's written not too long ago, and I think it's a key to understanding where we are, the difference between the two. Okay, over now.